For weeks, Corey Mallon and his gang tormented Jamari Benton, laughing at him in the hallways, mocking his size, his presence, his very right to exist in their school. They believed they were untouchable, convinced that no one would dare challenge them. Day by day, they pushed further, testing how far they could go, and then, one day, they decided it wasn't enough to whisper insults from a safe distance or shove him when no one was looking. No, they wanted more. They wanted a spectacle. They set the stage in front of everyone, confident that Jamari Benton would do what he always had: endure in silence, carry the weight of their humiliation without a word. But this time, Jamari Benton didn't shrink. When they crossed that final line, he rose, and for the first time in his life, he fought back. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe. The morning sun stretched long fingers of pale gold across the silent street as Jamari Benton stood at the edge of his new beginning, his breath curling in the crisp autumn air like wisps of invisible worry that refused to drift away. Behind him, the yellow bus pulled off with a mechanical groan, leaving him alone before the broad, red brick facade of Meadowbrook Middle School, an institution that, despite its cheerful banners and pristine glass windows, radiated a cold unfamiliarity that prickled beneath his skin. He tightened his grip on the worn strap of his backpack, the leather rough beneath his fingers, a small comfort in an otherwise uncertain landscape. The voices of students swirled around him, bright laughter here, hushed whispers there, all threading through the morning chill like strands in a tangled web he could already feel ensnaring him. He walked forward, each step deliberate, not slow but not hurried either, as if he could will the weight in his chest to lift with sheer composure alone. His mother's words echoed softly in his mind, firm and loving as always. Keep your head high, baby. No matter what they say about you, you show them what your worth looks like. He had promised her he would. As he crossed the threshold into the building, the warmth of the hallways wrapped around him, but it was a hollow warmth, like the sterile air of a place where kindness had no roots. Students clustered by lockers, some barely sparing him a glance, others letting their gazes linger just a fraction too long, curiosity laced with quiet judgment. Jamari was no stranger to stares. He had known them all his life, in grocery aisles, at playgrounds, across classroom desks. But here, there was something more pointed beneath the surface, a sharpening of eyes that made the hair on his arms rise, despite the heated corridors. His size always drew attention, though it was never his choice to carry this heavy frame. He had grown into it young, thick-set and powerful beneath layers of softness that belied the strength coiled within. But it was not just his body they saw, it was his skin, rich and deep, that marked him as an outsider long before he ever opened his mouth. In Meadowbrook, a place where uniformity passed as comfort, Jamari was a ripple in still waters. As he moved toward the administrative office to collect his schedule, he caught the murmurings at the edge of his hearing. "New kid," someone said, followed by a snicker buried beneath false innocence. "Look at him," another voice added, hushed, but not enough to escape notice. "Big as a linebacker." A soft chorus of laughter followed, not cruel yet, but sharpened with the promise of escalation. Tatis. Jonathan Reeves, standing just beyond the door of his history classroom, watched Jamari with eyes that missed little and understood much. Years of experience had taught Reeves to see beneath the surface, to recognize the quiet tension that stiffened the boy's shoulders, the practiced neutrality of his face. He saw the brewing storm, though Jamari himself did not yet show it openly. Reeves had witnessed this before, a young man walking into a place that would challenge not just his mind, but his very right to belong. For now, Reeves said nothing. He simply noted the interaction, cataloging the faces of the boys whose smiles were too wide, whose laughter came too quick, too rehearsed. Corey Mallon, with his perfect blonde hair and easy swagger, stood among them like a conductor orchestrating the first notes of a sinister melody. Beside him, Brett Snyder and Kyle Hopkins lingered, followers rather than leaders, their loyalty built on cowardice and conformity. Jamari reached the front desk, his voice steady as he spoke to the secretary, who handed him his schedule with a polite smile that did not quite reach her eyes. He thanked her softly, his manners intact despite the subtle chill that crept along his spine. Turning, he met Mr. Reeves's gaze for the briefest of moments. Not a stare, not a challenge, but a quiet acknowledgement that did not need words to be understood. As Jamari walked to his first class, he felt the weight of the building settle upon him fully. This was not just another school, not just another start. This was a proving ground, whether he had wanted it to be or not. Yet he carried his father's lessons like armor beneath his skin, remembering every moment of quiet strength and every hard-won truth about standing tall in a world that often sought to diminish him. The day had only just begun, but the undercurrents of conflict were already pulling at his feet, unseen but undeniable, as if the walls themselves had been waiting for his arrival to stir them awake. And though he could not yet know the full shape of the storm that loomed ahead, Jamari Benton walked into his first class with his shoulders squared, his gaze forward, and the silent promise burning in his chest that he would not bend, no matter how fierce the winds became. From the moment Jamari Benton eased into his assigned seat, the chair creaking beneath his weight in a way that seemed louder than anything else in the room, he felt the subtle yet undeniable shift in the atmosphere, as though the very walls of the classroom were drawing invisible lines around him, neatly fencing him off from the rest. The scrape of chairs, the shuffle of papers, all ordinary sounds of the morning, yet threaded through them was a low current of snickers and whispers that clung to the air like dust that refused to settle. Corey Mallon sat sprawled across his seat in the back of the room, one arm slung over the chair beside him. The picture of lazy arrogance, his eyes fixed on Jamari, with a glint of amusement that needed no explanation. Beside him, Brett Snyder and Kyle Hopkins leaned in like conspirators, their grins wide, hungry for sport, their eyes flicking from Corey to Jamari, with anticipation that made Jamari's stomach tighten beneath his broad chest. "Man, look at him," Corey murmured, just loud enough for his voice to carry, though not so loud that a teacher could claim to have overheard. "Chairs about to give out." The laugh that followed from Brett was sharp and eager, the kind of laugh that sought approval more than it found humor. "Hope they reinforced it," Brett chimed in, not bothering to lower his voice. "Could be a code red if he leans back." "Code red?" Kyle snorted, shaking his head as he snickered. "Try code earthquake." Jamari kept his gaze pinned to the front of the room, forcing his breath to stay even, though his fingers curled tightly around the edges of his desk, the cool surface grounding him even as a flicker of heat licked up his spine. He had heard worse, far worse, in places where words weren't the only weapons used against him. Yet here, in this pristine suburban classroom with its bright posters and polished floors, the sting felt different somehow, as if the sharpness of their ridicule was honed to a finer, colder edge. Mr. Reeves, stationed at the front of the classroom as he prepared to distribute the morning handouts, caught the undercurrent, but chose not to intervene yet. His eyes lingered on Jamari a heartbeat longer than necessary, his expression unreadable, but his gaze steady, thoughtful, as though he was weighing the moment, taking its measure. As the morning wore on, the teasing did not let up. It merely changed form, slipping beneath the surface of conversations, blooming into passing remarks laced with malice, thinly disguised as humor. In the hallway between classes, Corey took it a step further. As Jamari walked toward his locker, Corey slowed just enough to let his shoulder brush deliberately against him, the impact subtle but intentional, forcing Jamari to adjust his footing. Corey's voice followed, low and taunting, aimed for his ears alone, but not quiet enough to escape the notice of those around them. "Careful, big guy," Corey sneered. "You take out someone with those hips, they might have to call a tow truck to haul him off." Brett cackled, too loud for the space, drawing the attention of a few nearby students, most of whom quickly looked away, unwilling to be caught in the crossfire. "Hope the school's got insurance," Brett added, slapping the locker beside him for emphasis. Jamari's jaw tightened, his breath steady but laced with growing heat, as though the storm inside him had shifted slightly, the first rumble of thunder curling in his chest. He focused on the numbers of his locker, turning them with careful precision, refusing to give them even the smallest flicker of satisfaction. Yet, the tension followed him relentlessly into the cafeteria, that boiling, invisible weight settling heavier upon his shoulders as he claimed an empty table near the back, away from the clusters of students who had already formed their quiet alliances. His tray wobbled slightly as he set it down, the sound drawing a snort from Kyle, who nudged Brett and gestured toward Jamari with a jerk of his chin. "Better leave some food for the rest of us," Kyle quipped, his tone dripping with mock concern. "Big man looks like he's starving." "Starving?" Corey echoed, carrying his tray past Jamari's table with exaggerated care, like he was navigating a minefield. "He's about 2 seconds from eating the plate, plastic and all." Their laughter rippled outward, small but sharp, a needle prick beneath Jamari's skin. He met Corey's gaze then, not with anger, not yet, but with a level steadiness that, for just a fleeting moment, seemed to disrupt the flow of Corey's bravado. Corey's smirk faltered, if only slightly, before he recovered, waving off the moment with a derisive chuckle. "You better pace yourself, Benton," Corey added, his voice smooth as oil but just as slick with malice. "Lunch only comes once a day." From across the room, Mr. Reeves observed with growing tension tightening in his chest, his eyes narrowing as he took in the full tableau of humiliation unfolding before him. He saw it not as a singular moment, but as part of a pattern weaving itself around Jamari, a net of small cruelties designed to strangle his spirit before he ever had the chance to breathe freely in this place. Still, he waited. Intervention, too soon, would only scatter the shadows into deeper corners, harder to reach and harder still to expose. No, he would watch, and when the time was right, when the truth of these boys' actions stood undeniable, he would move, not with hesitation, but with certainty. As Jamari picked at his food, the storm within him churned slower, heavier, the weight of every sneer, every taunt, every echoing laugh piling higher until it pressed against the dam of his patience. He could feel it, not as fear, but as a rising certainty, a tightening coil that whispered in his bones that the time of quiet endurance was drawing toward its end. For now, he swallowed the storm. But storms, Jamari knew, could not be held back forever. The days that followed settled into a rhythm as predictable as it was suffocating. A cycle of sneers and snickers, of quiet insults dressed as jokes that trailed Jamari through the corridors like a shadow stitched to his heels. No matter where he walked, whether it was the locker-lined hallways that stretched too long beneath the fluorescent glare, or the cafeteria thick with the mingled smells of reheated lunches, he could feel their eyes on him, sharp as daggers, cold as winter rain. Corey had made it his personal crusade, it seemed, to ensure that Jamari never found a moment's peace, never passed a day without the weight of mockery pressing heavy upon his shoulders. He wielded his words like weapons, honed to cut deep without ever drawing visible blood, always dancing just beneath the threshold of what would force a teacher's hand. "Hey, wide load," Corey called one morning in the hallway, the words curling from his tongue like smoke from a slow-burning fire. His voice was slick with casual malice, a practiced ease that told Jamari this wasn't new for him. This was sport, a daily hunt. "Leave any breakfast for the rest of us, or did you eat the whole pantry again?" Brett's laughter followed, shrill and eager, clapping Corey on the back as if he'd delivered a masterstroke. "Don't worry, Corey," Brett said between snickers. "The school's got a backup cafeteria just for him." Jamari felt his fists curl at his sides, the nails pressing crescent moons into his palms. But he forced his breathing to remain steady, pushed the heat back down into the quiet furnace deep in his chest. His father's voice, steady and unyielding, whispered through the storm rising behind his ribs. "They only win if you let them see they've hurt you. Strength is in knowing when to wait. Patience, Jamari, patience, until the moment is yours." But patience, Jamari was beginning to realize, was not an endless reservoir. It had a bottom, and each insult, each sneer, was another stone dropped into its depths, drawing him closer to the breaking point. In class, the taunting was quieter, but no less sharp. Corey would pass folded notes, each one scrawled with crude cartoons exaggerating Jamari's size, grotesque figures drawn with cruel precision, often accompanied by captions like "Donut King" or "Next earthquake expected at 2 p.m. Blame Jamari. The papers would conveniently fall onto the floor near Jamari's desk, their intended target obvious, even if the teacher pretended not to see. Mr. Reeves, however, saw more than he let on. He noticed the way Jamari's posture had begun to stiffen, how his shoulders, once relaxed in quiet dignity, now carried a rigidness, as though bracing against a blow that had not yet fallen. He saw the slight tightening of Jamari's jaw, the flicker of heat in his otherwise composed eyes. Reeves, having long since learned the language of quiet suffering, read the signs as clearly as if they had been written in bold letters across the blackboard. After class one afternoon, as Jamari gathered his books in deliberate silence, Mr. Reeves approached him under the guise of reviewing his assignment. His voice was even, his words measured, but beneath them lay an undercurrent of concern too deep to hide completely. "You're handling a heavy load, Jamari," Mr. Reeves said quietly, his gaze steady and unwavering. "Don't carry it alone longer than you have to." Jamari's eyes met his, dark pools shadowed by the weight of too many unshed storms. He wanted to answer, wanted to say something that would give voice to the boiling tide beneath his calm surface, but the words caught in his throat, too tangled to untangle. So, he simply nodded, a slow dip of his head that carried more weight than 1,000 speeches. Mr. Reeves did not press further. He knew the choice to speak had to be Jamari's own, forged in his own time, in his own way. But even Mr. Reeves, as watchful as he was, could not have anticipated the escalation that awaited them, lurking just beyond the edges of an otherwise ordinary Friday afternoon. It began in whispers, like smoke curling from a hidden fire. Corey, emboldened by the laughter of his cronies and the silent complicity of the onlooking students, began laying plans for something bigger, something public, something that would tip the balance of their cruel game into spectacle. In the back corner of the cafeteria, Corey huddled with Brett and Kyle, their voices low, but their intent clear. "Milk, right over his head," Corey said, his grin wide and wicked. "Let's see if he cries dairy tears," Kyle snorted, eyes gleaming with malicious glee. "Hope they've got enough to soak him. Might need 2 cartons, maybe 3. Brett, eager as always to impress, chimed in. 4. He's a big target." Their laughter slithered across the room, curling around unsuspecting ears like poison gas, unseen yet unmistakably dangerous. Jamari, seated at his usual solitary table, felt the prickle of attention long before the act itself. His senses, sharpened by days of subtle warfare, caught the shift in the air, the way eyes flicked toward him and then away, the ripple of excitement that thrummed beneath the surface of the ordinary lunchtime noise. His chest tightened, breath caught in a steady rhythm that masked the slow burn rising inside. He did not know the full shape of what they planned, but he recognized the flavor of it, bitter and unmistakable. They wanted a show. What they did not know, what they could not possibly know, was that the moment they tipped the first drop of milk over his head, they would be uncorking a storm far fiercer than they could imagine. And storms, Jamari knew better than anyone, never ended the way they began. The day dawned with an eerie clarity, the kind of sharp-edged morning where the sun seemed just a little too bright, casting shadows that stretched long and thin across the school grounds, as if the very air sensed the weight of what was about to unfold. Jamari Benton felt it in the marrow of his bones before the first bell even rang, a heaviness not of dread, but of inevitability, as though every step he took toward the building carried him closer to an unseen precipice that had been carved out by weeks of quiet torment. Inside the hallways, there was a restless energy, a murmuring undercurrent slipping through conversations like a hidden undertow pulling at unwary feet. Jamari caught the sidelong glances, felt the fluttering hush that spread like ripples in water each time he passed by. Yet he held his composure with the same quiet strength that had carried him through every day before, though now it sat heavier upon his shoulders, pressing down like an invisible yoke. Corey Mallon, on the other hand, moved through the hallways with an exaggerated swagger, his grin sharp and predatory, flashing too often and too wide as though he could already taste the satisfaction of the spectacle he had planned. Brett and Kyle flanked him, barely containing their excitement, their eyes gleaming with the cruel anticipation of children who had set a trap and could not wait to watch it spring. Their whispers, intended to remain just out of reach, nevertheless drifted to Jamari's ears as he passed near the lockers, their voices dripping with malice, dressed as humor. "Got the milk ready?" Corey murmured, low enough to feign discretion, but loud enough to sting. Brett snickered, hoisting his backpack with a clink that betrayed the weight of the concealed carton. "Whole gallon, nice and cold," he replied, his eyes flicking toward Jamari with the smug satisfaction of someone who believed he already owned the outcome of the day. "Good," Corey said, his gaze lingering on Jamari's back, as though savoring the sight of his prey unaware, though in truth Jamari felt every glance like a prickle beneath his skin, every word like a thorn burrowing into the edges of his patience. As the lunch hour approached, the tension twisted tighter, a coil wound to the point of snapping. Jamari entered the cafeteria with steady steps, his expression carved from stone, but inside the storm churned with growing ferocity. He could sense the shift in the room, the way conversations dimmed and eyes began to follow him, the flicker of expectation dancing across faces that had once feigned disinterest. He moved to his usual spot near the back of the cafeteria, setting his tray down with measured care, every movement controlled, deliberate, as though by sheer force of will he could anchor himself against the tide swelling around him. Yet even as he sat, the hairs along the back of his neck stood on end, his senses sharpening with an almost preternatural clarity. From across the room, Corey gave the signal, a simple tilt of his chin, casual and understated, but to Brett and Kyle, it was the starting gun of their cruel performance. They approached with exaggerated nonchalance, Brett cradling the carton of milk like a prize trophy, his smirk wide enough to split his face. Corey followed a step behind, the maestro of this twisted orchestra, his eyes alight with triumph before the act was even complete. As they drew closer, time seemed to stretch, each second elongating as if the universe itself wished to savor the moment before the storm broke loose. Jamari's breath slowed, deepened, his heart thudding not with fear, but with the quiet roar of something ancient awakening within him, something that had lain dormant beneath layers of patience and restraint, now stirring at last. "Hey, Benton!" Corey's voice rang out, too loud for casual conversation, ensuring all nearby heads turned toward them, their curiosity piqued by the drama unfolding before their eyes. "You look a little thirsty, big man." Brett, unable to contain himself, added with a snigger, "Thought we'd help you cool off." Then, without pause, without hesitation, Brett tilted the carton forward, and a cold, unforgiving stream of milk poured over Jamari's head, cascading down his face and shoulders in chilling rivulets, soaking into his clothes, dripping in fat, glistening drops onto the floor beneath him. Gasps scattered through the cafeteria like startled birds, a ripple of shock chasing the moment. The milk ran into Jamari's eyes, blurring his vision, but not enough to mask the sight of Corey's triumphant grin or the convulsions of laughter shaking Brett and Kyle as they took in the fruits of their cruelty. Around them, the crowd swelled, whispers turning to murmurs, murmurs rising to laughter, a chorus of mockery that wrapped itself around Jamari like chains forged from every slight, every insult, every cruel word he had endured. Something deep inside him, something forged not from this moment alone, but from every moment like it that had come before, cracked wide open. Jamari rose, not with the sluggishness they expected from someone burdened by shame, but with a slow, terrifying deliberation, his movements smooth and unhurried, as though he were a force of nature unfolding from the earth itself. Milk dripped from his chin, his clothes clinging to him like a second skin, but there was no embarrassment in his posture, no humiliation in the set of his jaw, only fire. Corey's grin faltered, the first flicker of uncertainty darkening his eyes, as Jamari's gaze, sharp and unyielding, locked onto him with the intensity of a storm bearing down upon a trembling tree. "You think this is funny?" Jamari's voice, low and even, carried across the space between them, not raised yet, not filled with rage, but heavy with something far more dangerous, conviction. For a moment, Corey hesitated, his smirk wavering as the weight of Jamari's presence pressed down upon him. But bravado, once set in motion, is a hard thing to abandon. "Yeah," Corey sneered, forcing a laugh that came out too brittle. "What are you going to do about it, Tubby?" What Jamari did next unfolded not in an explosion of wild fury, but in a precise, devastating burst of power, controlled and focused, as though every insult had been a hammer blow, forging him into the weapon he had now become. And in that moment, the balance of power, so long tilted against him, began to shift with the unstoppable force of an avalanche set free. For a breathless instant, it was as if the entire cafeteria had been swallowed by silence, a heavy, suffocating stillness that draped itself over every student, every teacher lingering by the doors, even over Corey and his gang, whose bravado had frozen mid-laugh, suspended in the dawning realization that something irreversible had been set into motion. Milk continued to drip from Jamari's soaked shirt in steady rivulets, splattering the linoleum floor with pale drops that marked the moment time itself seemed to hold its breath. Jamari did not move in haste, nor did he allow the storm within him to erupt in reckless fury. Instead, he rose from his seat with a quiet, terrifying calm, his broad frame unfolding slowly, deliberately, as though he had all the time in the world. His eyes, dark and burning with a fire stoked not only by today's humiliation, but by every whispered insult, every mocking glance, every sharp word that had tried to carve away his dignity, locked onto Corey with a weight that crushed the smirk from the boy's face before a single word was spoken. Corey's false bravado cracked at the edges, the corners of his mouth twitching as he attempted to summon the swagger that had always carried him through moments like this, yet it slipped from his grasp like sand through trembling fingers. "Relax, man," Corey said, his voice tight with a forced lightness that could not mask the uncertainty bleeding into his eyes. It was just a joke. But there was no humor left in the air, no echo of laughter in the crowd that had once fed off Corey's cruelty. They watched now with wide, unblinking eyes, as if witnessing something raw and primal unfold before them. something they could neither stop nor look away from. Jamari's gaze flicked briefly to Brett, then to Kyle, both of whom were retreating a cautious step behind Corey, their previous bravado shriveling beneath the weight of what they had unleashed. Without a word, Jamari stepped forward, and the simple motion was enough to send a tremor through the small circle that had formed around them. "You thought this would make you bigger?" Jamari's voice rolled out, deep and steady, each word carrying the weight of an avalanche that had finally begun its descent. "You thought making me the target would hide what you really are?" Corey swallowed hard, and though he tried to speak, no words came. Jamari's hand moved fast, not wild, not uncontrolled, but swift with precision, honed by instinct, and a life that had demanded he learn to defend himself long before any teacher had offered him sanctuary. His palm caught Corey clean across the cheek, the sharp crack of contact slicing through the hush, like lightning splitting a storm-black sky. Corey staggered sideways, clutching his face with wide-eyed disbelief, the redness blooming across his pale skin as evidence of a reality he could no longer deny. Before Brett or Kyle could even think to react, Jamari's fist found Brett's chest, driving the air from his lungs with a hollow thud that left him gasping like a fish hauled from water. Kyle, caught between cowardice and desperation, lunged clumsily toward Jamari, but Jamari sidestepped the attempt with a fluidity that belied his size, his arm sweeping out in a controlled arc that caught Kyle square across the shoulder, sending him sprawling to the floor in a heap of limbs and fear. The crowd recoiled, gasps rising like waves crashing against the shore, yet beneath the shock lay a deeper current, a stirring recognition that what they were witnessing was not mere retaliation, but a reclamation of power that had been too long denied. Teachers surged forward at last, their shouts piercing the rising noise of the cafeteria, but they were too late to prevent what had already been set in unstoppable motion. Mr. Reeves, moving faster than any of his colleagues, pushed through the wall of students just in time to see Corey scramble to his feet, fury and humiliation twisting his features as he lunged recklessly toward Jamari, fists clenched, his earlier arrogance burned away by desperation. Jamari caught Corey mid-charge, his arms locking around him, not with the intent to crush, but to contain, to control, as though he understood that this fight, though ignited by his own fury, did not need to end in chaos to deliver its message. He held Corey firm for a breathless moment before shoving him backward, not with rage but with unyielding force, sending him tumbling across the floor once more. "Enough!" Mr. Reeves's voice thundered across the cafeteria, silencing the remaining whispers and freezing the unfolding spectacle in place. His eyes, fierce and unblinking, swept across the scene, taking in the fallen boys, the scattered cartons of milk, the pool of liquid spreading beneath Jamari's feet like the remnants of a storm finally spent. Jamari, chest heaving but gaze still clear, turned toward Mr. Reeves with a steadiness that spoke volumes more than any words could have conveyed in that moment. He did not offer excuses, nor did he hang his head in shame, because there was none to be found. His actions had not been born of recklessness, but of necessity, of a line crossed too many times until it could no longer hold. Corey, groaning from the floor, glared up at Jamari, with eyes blazing not with victory, but with fear, poorly disguised as fury. His lip trembled as he spat out bitter words, though they landed hollow in the aftermath of his defeat. "You're dead, Benton," Corey hissed, but even he could hear the weakness in his threat, could feel the shifting tides beneath his words as the eyes of their classmates no longer saw a king among them, but a pretender unmasked. Mr. Reeves stepped fully between them now, placing a firm hand on Jamari's shoulder, not in reprimand, but in a silent gesture of restraint, of protection, of solidarity. His gaze swept over the gathered students, and though his face was carved from stone, there was a flicker of something deeper in his eyes. Not anger, but understanding. Not condemnation, but resolve. "Everyone back to class," he commanded, his voice brooking no argument. "Now!" Reluctantly, the crowd began to disperse, their whispers trailing behind them like smoke from a dying fire. But the memory of what they had witnessed would linger far longer than the echoes of their retreat. Jamari allowed himself to be led from the cafeteria, his head held high, his chest still rising and falling with the force of the storm that had not left him. Not yet. He knew this was far from over, knew the consequences were waiting just beyond the horizon of this moment, but for the first time since stepping into Meadowbrook's halls, he felt something solid beneath his feet. Not fear, not shame, but power. The echoes of the fight had barely faded from the walls of the cafeteria when the storm found its second wind, this time not in the raw clang of fists or the crash of bodies colliding with the floor, but in the cold, polished confines of the administrative office, where voices sharpened to blades and battle lines were drawn not with knuckles, but with words dripping venom. Even before Jamari had fully settled into the hard-backed chair placed outside Principal Ellison's door, the air thrummed with tension so thick it seemed to choke the very oxygen from the space around him. Behind the closed door, voices clashed like unseen thunder, Corey's parents having arrived with a speed and fury that left no doubt they had been waiting, poised like vultures for the first hint of trouble that could serve their narrative. "Mr. Mallon's voice rose first, sharp and grating, full of indignant outrage that left no room for subtlety. "This is outrageous, Deborah," he snapped, dispensing with any pretense of formality as he addressed the principal by her first name, as though familiarity alone could sway the outcome in his favor. "My son was attacked, assaulted, in front of dozens of witnesses. Are you telling me you're hesitating to punish this boy? Are you serious?" Mrs. Mallon's voice followed, shrill and scalding, her words tumbling over her husband's in their haste to find the mark. "We should be talking expulsion. No, we should be talking police involvement. That brute could have killed our Corey." Through the thin office walls, Jamari heard every syllable, each one a lash across his back. Not for their sting, but for the bitter familiarity they carried. He had known, deep in his bones, that this moment would come, had seen it unfold behind his closed eyes in the seconds after he had delivered the first blow. Yet knowing did not lessen the weight of it, as it settled heavily over his chest. Mr. Reeves sat beside him, not in the seat across the hallway where nervous teachers sometimes waited, but directly at Jamari's side, his posture upright, his expression carved from iron. He said nothing, but the weight of his presence alone anchored Jamari against the swell of doubt that threatened to rise within him. Inside the office, Principal Ellison's voice finally emerged, tight with the strain of balancing a dozen conflicting pressures. "I understand your concern, Mr. and Mrs. Mallon," she began, her tone measured, but beneath it, Jamari detected the tremble of a woman walking a tightrope strung high over a pit of sharpened stakes. "But there are circumstances we must consider. Reports from other students indicate there may have been circumstances." Mr. Mallon cut in sharply, his incredulity laced with fury. "He's twice my boy's size. Corey is practically a child compared to him. What circumstances could possibly justify that kind of brutality?" For a moment, silence pressed against the walls like a rising tide, and then Mr. Reeves rose smoothly from his seat, his gaze firm as stone as he turned toward the closed door. "They never see their own cruelty until it's reflected back at them," he said quietly, more to Jamari than to anyone else, though the words seemed to hang in the space between them like an unspoken vow. Jamari's eyes met his, steady despite the fire still simmering in his chest, and he gave a slight nod, not of defeat but of acknowledgement, an understanding that the battle had shifted terrain, but was far from finished. Moments later, the office door swung open with an abruptness that startled the waiting secretary, who quickly busied herself with a stack of papers as though the fluttering pages might shield her from the confrontation unfolding before her eyes. "Mr. Reeves," Principal Ellison called, her gaze flicking briefly to Jamari, before settling on the teacher with a mixture of relief and expectation. "Would you step inside, please?" Without hesitation, Mr. Reeves complied, pausing only to rest a steadying hand on Jamari's shoulder, a brief but powerful reassurance that he would not allow the truth of what had occurred to be buried beneath the weight of the Mallons' outrage. As the door closed behind him, Jamari found himself momentarily alone, save for the secretary who dared not meet his gaze, her attention fixed firmly on the task of pretending nothing out of the ordinary had transpired. But Jamari's mind remained fixed on the voices that filtered through the office walls, catching fragments of the debate as it ebbed and flowed. "He's a known troublemaker," Mrs. Mallon insisted, her voice sharp as broken glass. "I've heard the stories from other parents. He came here from a city school, didn't he? Probably brought the violence with him." "That's unsubstantiated," Principal Ellison countered, though her words lacked conviction. "We have no records of disciplinary issues prior to this incident." "Stories spread for a reason, Deborah," Mr. Mallon pressed. "Do the right thing." Inside the office, Mr. Reeves's voice rose, calm but unyielding, each word a chisel striking at the false narrative being constructed before them. "With respect, Mr. Mallon," Reeves began, "I've witnessed the undercurrents in this school long before Jamari Benton ever set foot here. What your son and his friends subjected him to was not harmless teasing, it was sustained harassment, provocation, baiting, humiliation, until they finally pushed him past his limit. This was no unprovoked attack. For a beat, no one replied, and Jamari felt a flicker of something fragile yet powerful stir in his chest, the first breath of hope threading its way through the thicket of fear and frustration. Principal Ellison's voice, when it came next, was quieter, thoughtful in a way that suggested the cracks in her resolve were widening. "We will need to investigate further," she said at last. "Both sides will have their say." Jamari exhaled slowly, allowing himself a moment of cautious relief. Mr. Reeves had tilted the scales, if only slightly, and now, with the truth poised to step into the light, the path toward justice, though still treacherous, had begun to clear, and Jamari, battered but unbroken, would walk that path to its very end. By the following morning, the corridors of Meadowbrook felt tighter somehow, as though the very walls had crept closer overnight, narrowing the spaces through which students moved, funneling them into uneasy currents of tension and speculation. The usual morning chatter, which once rang with carefree noise, had been replaced by low, restless murmurs that buzzed just beneath the surface, impossible to ignore, yet reluctant to rise fully into the open. Every conversation seemed to orbit around the same gravitational pull, dragging students inevitably back to the fight in the cafeteria, to the towering figure of Jamari Benton, and to the uncertain question of what would come next. Jamari felt the weight of those unspoken questions pressing against him from every angle, yet he bore it with a quiet strength that seemed to settle even more firmly across his broad shoulders as the day unfolded. He moved through the hallways with his usual calm, his footsteps measured, his head unbowed despite the flood of glances that trailed him like invisible threads pulled taut by curiosity and fear in equal measure. Some of those glances, he noticed, carried a different shade now, a flicker of something that wasn't quite fear, not quite judgment, but a hesitant, growing awareness. Students who had once joined in the snickers, or at least turned their backs to the daily mockery, now found their gazes lingering a fraction longer, their expressions tight with something closer to uncertainty, perhaps even the first stirrings of doubt in the story they had so easily accepted before. Mr. Reeves observed this subtle shift from a careful distance, choosing for the moment to watch rather than speak. He had already planted his flag firmly in the ground the day before, had made clear his position in front of both the Mallons and Principal Ellison. Now, he understood, the battle would not be won by forceful declarations alone, but by quietly strengthening the foundation beneath Jamari's feet, fortifying him against the growing storm. It came as no surprise when, barely an hour into the day, Mrs. Mallon arrived at the school, sweeping through the front office with the rigid posture of someone who had already decided she would accept nothing less than complete victory. Her heels clicked sharply against the tile, a rhythmic staccato that announced her presence long before she spoke. She carried herself with the precision of a practiced adversary, her eyes hard, her mouth set into a line so thin it might have been carved from stone. "I want to see Principal Ellison," she demanded of the secretary, her tone brooking no argument. "Now!" The secretary, already pale beneath the weight of the day's tensions, nodded quickly and disappeared behind the door, returning moments later to usher Mrs. Mallon inside with an air of quiet dread. Jamari, waiting nearby as instructed, heard the door close behind her, but could still catch fragments of the conversation bleeding through the walls, sharp and cutting despite the barrier. "This has gone on long enough," Mrs. Mallon's voice carried, tight and scolding. "My son is the victim here, and yet the boy who attacked him still walks these halls. What kind of message does that send to the rest of our students?" Principal Ellison's reply was more measured, her words chosen carefully, though Jamari could hear the strain beneath them. "We are reviewing the incident in its entirety, Mrs. Mallon. There are conflicting accounts." "Conflicting?" Mrs. Mallon's voice sharpened, slicing clean through the air. "The only thing conflicting is your sense of priorities, Deborah. My son has been humiliated. He's bruised, bloodied. Do you really want to see this escalate further?" There was a pause, just long enough for Jamari to imagine Principal Ellison weighing the threat for what it truly was. Not just a mother's outrage, but the looming shadow of lawsuits and board meetings, of public scandal whispered from one household to the next. And then came the words that made Jamari's chest tighten, not with fear, but with a simmering frustration that coiled deeper beneath his ribs. "We've already spoken with our attorney," Mrs. Mallon continued smoothly, her confidence growing with every syllable. "If this school refuses to protect my son, we'll see to it that the district does." Outside the office, Mr. Reeves did not pace, did not let frustration crease his features. He remained steady, his eyes thoughtful as he noted the rhythm of the conversation, understanding that battles of this kind were fought not only in bursts of passion, but in the quiet, relentless pursuit of truth. Without making a show of it, he had already begun gathering statements from students brave enough to speak. Emma Chen, who had witnessed the weeks of provocations with growing discomfort, and Kevin Morales, whose quiet observance had captured details others had missed. They were small victories, perhaps, but they mattered more than theatrics. Later that day, as classes shuffled by in a haze of half-focused lessons and restless glances toward the clock, Jamari found himself beside Mr. Reeves in the hallway outside the history room. Mr. Reeves's voice, low and calm, threaded between the noise of passing students as he addressed him with a quiet certainty. "They're pushing harder now," Reeves said, not as a warning, but as a simple truth laid bare. "They believe pressure will bend the truth to their will." Jamari's gaze remained forward, fixed on the distant end of the hallway as though it stretched far beyond the school, beyond this day, beyond the weight pressing against his chest. His reply was steady, quiet, but laced with a resolve that had been tempered in the fire of long, silent battles. "Pressure makes steel," Jamari said, the words not forced, but natural, the truth of them embedded deep in his bones. A faint flicker of something almost like pride touched the corners of Mr. Reeves's mouth, though he said nothing further, simply offering a short nod of agreement before turning back to his duties. As the day drew toward its heavy close, Jamari carried those words with him like armor, knowing well that the Malins would not relent easily, that the storm had not yet broken, and that shadows still gathered in corners unseen. But he also knew this: storms passed, no matter how fiercely they howled. And when they did, the ground left behind belonged to those who had stood their ground through the worst of it. And Jamari Benton, battered but unbowed, would not be moved. The days following Mrs. Malin's sharp demands passed not with relief, but with a mounting pressure that wrapped itself tighter around Meadowbrook's halls, a coil slowly winding toward the inevitable snap. If the storm had first been confined within the walls of the school, it was now spilling beyond them, seeping into the homes and conversations of the town, threading its way through breakfast tables and evening news feeds alike. Whispers became discussions, discussions sharpened into debates, and soon enough, the name Jamari Benton was carried on the lips of people who had never seen his face, but had already painted their judgments across it in broad, unforgiving strokes. Mrs. Malin, relentless in her crusade, had moved her efforts to the wider community with ruthless precision, her carefully crafted narrative slipping into neighborhood meetings, circulating through parent email chains, and finding eager audiences among those already primed to believe the worst of a boy who did not fit their picture of belonging. She stood before these groups with the poise of a seasoned advocate, her voice steady, her expression carved from righteous indignation as she recounted her version of the events, a mother's tale of her son, an innocent, brutalized without cause by a larger, dangerous outsider. They called it bullying, she proclaimed during one such gathering at the local community center, her tone heavy with disdain. But what we saw was a violent assault, plain and simple. My son, Corey, is traumatized. He was targeted, cornered, and attacked in cold blood. If we let this go unanswered, what kind of message are we sending to our children? Her words, carefully selected and delivered with practiced fervor, drew tight nods from many in the crowd, their faces pinched with concern, their fears stoked by the image she had so vividly painted. Yet, even as her influence spread outward like ripples across a pond, countercurrents began to stir beneath the surface, subtle, but growing stronger by the hour. Inside the school, Mr. Reeves worked not from stages or platforms, but through the quiet, deliberate collection of truth. He moved through the classrooms and hallways not with grand declarations, but with quiet conversations and steady encouragement, giving voice to those who had watched from the margins and carried the weight of knowing what had truly unfolded. Emma Chen, once hesitant to step into the fray, found her resolve hardening beneath Mr. Reeves's quiet guidance. She sat across from him in the corner of an empty